Hello, back for day two. I don't know if this will be a daily thing, maybe a weekly thing, but I thought I'd come back today to read the rest of the first chapter of The Adventures of Charlie Smithers, and also I should have read the back cover blurb here, so I'll do that without further ado, so that you'll understand the story better. The time is the 19th century, the place the Serengeti Plain, where one Charlie Smithers, faithful servant to the arrogant bonehead Lord Brampton, with 5 lines in Debrett and a hopeless shot to boot, becomes separated from his master during an unfortunate episode with an angry rhinoceros, thereby launching Charlie on an odyssey into deepest, darkest Africa, and into the arms of the beautiful Loyan. And that's where the trouble really begins. Maasai warriors, xenophobic locals, or evil Arab slavers, the two forbidden lovers encounter everything that the unforgiving jungle can throw at them. So, with that done, we'll get back to the story. Now, as you'll recall, Charlie had just, in order to save Lord Brampton, Charlie had run interference on the rhinoceros and had just jumped over a cliff and finds himself poised 100 feet over the Mara River and way down below. And apparently I hadn't really thought his escape all the way through. So I'll just go back, that one line. Down I plummeted. Oh well, as the saying goes, it's not the fall that will hurt you. Then he goes back into his catching up. Now, my old man certainly knew what he was talking about. Gentlemen had foibles, and by the cartload too. And being gentlemen, their foibles were of an altogether grander nature than yours or mine. Take my master, for instance. He was always the great one for the hunt, but the problem was, no matter how hard he tried, he could never hit the broadside of a barn door. But then neither could any of his forebears, so perhaps there may have been something inherited to it all. Yet even when marksmanship was an issue, as in riding to the hounds, although he sat a horse very well and could ride like a red Indian, there was always the most appalling bad luck attending him. Many's the time I can recall while the far-off belling of the hounds led the other tops over hill and through dale, my master would invariably blunder into a wood wild with enthusiasm and stay hopelessly lost until I, having witnessed with sinking heart the trees crashing and swaying for hours on end, while he careened about in frenetic peregrination, ventured in to bring him back for tiffin. Consequently, as the years passed and the walls of the gunroom at Brampton Manor remained bare and unadorned, had done so since time immemorial, and are so to this very day. That came as no surprise to the common folk, for word had long since spread that in this regard at least the family was cursed. That in itself might not have been the end of the world. Peers, after all, seldom paid much notice to the common herd, except for the fact that the subject was dear to the hearts of that ancient blue-blooded line. For it had long been a family notion handed down from father to son over many generations that they were country nobility. Not for them was the society of London. Rather they perceived themselves to be made of sterner stuff than those stylish fops, and fancied that the harsh nature of their northern estates fit them as naturally as a well-tailored coat. While there may have been some truth to this, try as they might, they could never shake those dark whispers, and as the local superstitions eventually became accepted by some of the nobility itself, they considered it a personal disgrace. Now all that talk of being cursed was just so much bollocks, if you ask me. However, I do have to admit there seemed to be a distressingly long list of unfortunate episodes that might appear to give credence to those whispers. Like there was a time at the hunt when the steed accidentally trod on young Lady Wingate's foot. Poor girl, she was in plaster up to her hips for ages, and though it was never confirmed, may well have been the cause for the breaking off of their engagement. Then there was that time when he, perhaps rashly, in an attempt to throw off the shackles of superstition, had promised his father a brace of quail for the table that evening, but the only blood to be spilled was when his gun caught on a bramble and the discharge filled a beater's backside with bird shot. Or the time when we were hunting deer on the eastern fell, but then that was long ago and best not spoken of. Besides, that Gillies widow was endowed with a pension for life, so all's well that ends well. I suppose, given the Bramptons' inborn sense of bloodlust and perhaps, if my impertinence may be forgiven, a certain lack of reason rendering them unfit for much else, it was only natural that the family should have a time-honored tradition of purchasing commissions in the military. Hence you shall generally find that at least one of that noble family was present at some of our nation's more notable defeats. Why, my lord's grandfather lost a leg at Saratoga when at a critical moment, while bravely attempting to lead a bayonet charge into the thickest part of the fray, with the last of our dwindling reserves, tripped over his sword, severing the tendons behind the knee. Many years later in the peninsula, his father, the present earl, led a charge at Corunna in the wrong direction and was subsequently shot out of the saddle by some annoyed Highlanders. As the story goes, the ball caught him squarely in the forehead, but by great good fortune was already spent. Sadly, however, the blow rendered him severely cross-eyed and looked to do so for the remainder of his days. Of course, I followed my master to the colours in our own time as well, and with thoughts firmly set on bloodshed and glory, sailed with him to the Crimea. Well, I saw enough bloodshed to last me a lifetime and no air, and while I'm not saying that there wasn't any glory, if there was, I never saw it. I suppose all the world's heard of Balaclava by now, made famous by the Light Brigade's charge and helped along by Alfred Lord Tennyson's romantic poem, which was so much poppycock if you ask me. It was a bloody shambles, that's what it was, and a disgrace to British arms, and my own personal disgrace foremost amongst it all. You see, it had been pure and simple hell riding up that valley, both shot and shell screaming through our ranks, sweeping away our fellows in giant handfuls, but so far, by the grace of God, my master and I had managed to pull through unscathed. Yet even as we drew nigh the guns, I saw the Ivans wheeling that piece round to catch us in flank, and saw that bearded blighter touch his match to it too. But the worst of it was that I saw the discharge was set to scythe directly across Lord Brampton's path, and when that happened it would almost certainly blow him to smithereens. So with my dad's words ringing in my ears, even o'er the roar of the cannon, I urged my mount forward, but lamentably was not in time to shield him completely. The round lifted us both from the saddle, for the best I could do was to only partially absorb the charge, shredding the muscle from my shoulder and taking a few balls of canister in my leg. But at length, when I came to my senses, amidst all the blood-curdling thunder of hoofs and cannon and the hair-raising screams of the wounded and dying, I was able to crawl my way over to my poor master, and was horrified to see that great gaping wound in his abdomen. That was a bad time, I can tell you. I'd thought he was a goner at first, and that my failure was absolute. But then I noticed that somehow he was still breathing. Where there was breath, there was life, as the saying goes, and where there was life, there was still hope, no matter how slender. I don't rightly recollect how I was able to get him back, and with only one arm to do it with too, but I must have managed it. I remember grabbing at the reins of a horse with an empty saddle, but the rest is just so much blank confusion of coming back through all that hell until we'd finally reached our lines and had summoned the surgeon. That worthy had shaken his head with deep gravity when he saw my lord's wounds, but when he took note of the fretful state I was in, had set about them regardless of his misgivings. It had been a long and painstaking affair, with him pulling out sundered entrails by the yard, and me hovering anxiously, helping as best I could, which I'm sorry to say wasn't much. When at last he was finished stitching him up, there was such a pile of gory intestines on the ground beside him that I wondered if he had left any inside my poor master. But at last he rose to his feet and put his bloodied hand on my good shoulder. "It's in the hands of God now, Charlie," he said, although I could see he didn't hold much hope. Then, clucking his tongue in that disapproving way he always had, added, "Now let's see about saving that arm of yours." 4 weeks later, I felt the very picture of misery while my master hovered between life and death. Many's the time I thought the fever was going to carry him away, but whatever they lack in other areas, Brantons have the constitutions of bulls. Even so, it was a close-run thing, as the old Duke used to say. And when he finally did open his eyes, I was so relieved that I hobbled over with my arm in a sling, threw myself to the ground, and begged his forgiveness for having failed him so completely. He had every right to sack me, of course, or at the very least have me shot for cowardice, but believe it or not, all he murmured was, "Better luck next time," or something else along that line, before drifting back to a laudanum-induced sleep. Now I ask you, is that or is that not a true gentleman? After such a horrible experience, you'd have thought it would be nothing but easy street for him from then on, wouldn't you? If it were any other man, I dare say you would be right, too, but my master would have none of it. Weak and wan though he was, when invalided out of the army, and having returned to England, Lord Brampton soon found that he was no longer suited for the quiet country life. For once having tasted it beneath that noble breast, there burned an unquenchable thirst for adventure. So it was with little surprise when one evening, some months after our return to Brampton Manor, I was summoned to his side. I found my lord in his rooms, pacing back and forth in evident excitement. His face was set in the way he had of showing the decision he'd come to was, as usual, the one he desired. "Smithers," he cried, already showing signs of coming into the bloom of health, like a man reborn, "pack my bags. We're off to see the world." "Certainly, your grace," I bowed carefully and somewhat awkwardly from my crutch. My arm was also still in its sling, but healing famously. "May I be so bold as to inquire where we are going?" "Why, haven't you ears? I said the world, didn't I?" "Yes, of course, my lord, but—" His brows knit together. "But what? Come on, man, out with it." "But what part of the world, sir, if you don't mind my asking?" I needed this information so as to reckon on which of my lord's togs it was best to stash away into his travelling chests. "Why, the world, Smithers, the whole lot. Every last nook and cranny, every last jungle and sand dune, every last teepee and igloo, every last square inch, in fact, or," he amended slightly, "at least as much of it that's British." "Oh." I couldn't hide my surprise, for this was doing it up handsomely and no error. In fact, this was such a grand affair that more luggage would have to be purchased in order to transport so much of my lord's wardrobe, and his guns too, of course. And so, to make a long story short, 7 months later, with both our wounds healing in the process, having taken a mail packet to Cairo, then overland by camel caravan to the Gulf of Suez, before taking an East Indiaman to Mombasa, here we were, with my lord trundling back to camp unattended, and me plummeting to almost certain death. Speaking of which, legs straight, arms tight to my side. There was a tremendous splash and water engulfed me. The shock struck most of the air from my lungs, and I was still sinking like a stone. What great luck! Apparently I had fallen into a deep eddy or a pool. I was saved. But before I could exult too much, my descent was suddenly arrested by a bone-jarring crunch on the gravelly riverbed. A pair of sharp snaps was quickly interpreted into the knowledge that I had broken both my ankles. What little air remained in my lungs was now expelled by a subaquatic scream of agony. Water flowed into my nostrils and into my mouth. My confused mind was so disoriented from the fall and the searing pain I didn't know which way was up. I thrashed about, but without evident effect, for with both ankles broken, my legs were now useless. Yet just as I was about to black out and give in to the river's insistence it should take me, my head miraculously broke the surface, and I found myself spluttering water from my lungs. I coughed and coughed until my stomach cramped and I was spewing muck all over the place,
But once I had retched up most of that disgusting filth, I looked up at the clear blue sky and the world all around me, and knew that I had somehow survived. Treading water with my arms, I fairly crowed with triumph. "They haven't got you yet, Charlie," I cried, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. "The world's tried and tried, but you ain't bloody dead yet. Bloody marvelous, bloody indestructible, that's what you are." I was so loud in my rejoicing that I almost didn't hear the splash, or the sound very like boulders rumbling together, but not quite like that. No, not quite. This sound was hungrier somehow. Subdued now, I peered over my shoulder to the far shore and was able to catch sight of the last of the leathery forms as it took to the water. It was enormous. "Oh, crumbs," I said. "Crocodiles." And that's the end of the first chapter.